Picture this, a dimly lit chamber deep within a medieval monastery where the fate of two warring kingdoms hangs in the balance. The air is thick with tension, the men at the table locked in stubborn silence, until a woman steps forward. She wears no crown, holds no official title, yet with quiet authority, she weaves words like a tapestry of peace. By dawn, the conflict is resolved, her name absent from the treaties, her role erased from the records. This wasn't an anomaly, it was a hidden thread in the fabric of history, one we've only just begun to unravel. Medieval history loves its kings, knights, and bishops' figures etched in stone and parchment. But behind every siege averted, every truce brokered, there were women who moved unseen through the shadows of power. They were the quiet strategists, the spiritual guides, the peacemakers who turned the tide without drawing a sword. Society told them their place was in the home, yet they carved spaces in cloisters, courts, and even battlefields, wielding influence through wisdom rather than force. How many of their stories were buried under the weight of time? How many legacies were reduced to footnotes or forgotten entirely? Today, we're lifting the veil on 25 of these extraordinary women, ones who straddled the roles of priest and peacemaker in secret. They prayed in hidden chapels, whispered counsel to rulers, and forged alliances when men could not. Their tools weren't weapons but words, faith, and an uncanny understanding of human hearts. From abbesses who ruled like diplomats to mystics who advised popes, their lives were a delicate dance of devotion and daring. This isn't just a list, it's a reclamation. A chance to hear their voices echo across the centuries, finally stepping into the light they were so often denied. Ready to meet them, let's begin. The medieval world was built on rigid rules, especially for women. Their lives were supposed to follow a narrow path, daughter, wife, mother, always under the authority of men. But history has a funny way of bending rules when no one's looking. Behind the locked gates of convents and the curtained chambers of noble courts, women found cracks in the system. They couldn't hold official titles, but they could hold something far more powerful: knowledge. Healing herbs, sacred texts, the quiet art of persuasion, these became their tools. Take Hildegard of Bingen, the visionary abbess who penned theological works so profound that popes sought her counsel. Her voice shouldn't have mattered in a man's world, yet it echoed across Europe, and she wasn't alone. Monasteries doubled as sanctuaries for learning, where women like her transcribed manuscripts, brewed medicines, and even mediated feuds between warring lords. Noblewomen, too, played the game differently. While their husbands clashed on battlefields, they hosted dinners, brokered marriages, and slipped strategic advice into prayers. Society called them virtuous for their piety, never realizing how much power piety could hide. One such woman was Adelheid of Burgundy, a name lost to most history books. By day, she was a dutiful nun, tending to the sick with remedies passed down through generations. By night, she was the secret architect of peace in a region torn by bloodshed. When two rival counts refused to speak, it was Adelheid who carried messages between them, her habit granting her safe passage where soldiers would have been cut down. She healed wounds with herbs and treaties with words, her dual role so seamless that chroniclers barely noticed, but the villages she saved, they remembered. Adelheid's story is just the first thread we're pulling from the tapestry. How many others like her were erased by ink that only favored swords? In the rolling hills of 12th century France, where noble feuds left villages in ashes, one woman turned a convent into a fortress of peace. Meet Abbess Heloise of St. Pierre, a woman whose name should be etched alongside history's great diplomats but wasn't. when the Count of Anjou and the Duke of Burgundy plunged their lands into war over a stolen bride, it was Heloise who stopped the bleeding. Not with an army, but with ink, ingenuity, and the unshakable authority of her faith, her convent became neutral ground, a place where sworn enemies could meet under the guise of pilgrimage. But her real genius lay in the details. Letters between warring lords were smuggled inside prayer books, their terms disguised as pious reflections. She enlisted sympathetic bishops to carry messages, their clerical robes offering immunity from suspicion. And when tensions peaked, she hosted a feast for both families on the feast day of Saint Agnes, the patron of peace. No one could refuse a holy occasion, and over shared bread, grudges began to crumble. Publicly, Heloise was the model of devotion, her days spent in prayer and charity. Privately, she mastered the art of leverage. She knew which bishop feared scandal, which knight's wife longed for her son's safe return, which merchant owed the convent favors. Piece by piece, she pulled these threads until a truce was inevitable. Yet when the final agreement was signed, her name appeared nowhere. Chroniclers credited the Duke's sudden change of heart and the Count's divine inspiration. What did it cost her, this life of hidden influence? The weight of secrecy lingers in her surviving letters, where she confesses to a fellow abbess, "We light candles for peace, yet dare not claim the flame." Her story forces us to ask, how many victories were won by women who could never take credit? How many wars ended because someone like Haileys knew how to turn piety into power and then vanish into the shadows? Deep in the Black Forest, where mist clung to the pine needles like secrets, a woman known only as Mother Elspitt wove healing into the fabric of rebellion. To the villagers, she was a simple herb wife, gathering yarrow and comfrey under the moon's watchful eye. But to the runaway serfs, the persecuted Jews, the wives fleeing violent husbands who found her hidden grove, she was something far more dangerous, a priestess without a title, a peacemaker without a crown. Her sanctuary was a circle of ancient oaks, their trunks carved with runes no monk could decipher. Here, she didn't just mend broken bones with poultices of woundwort, she tended to fractured loyalties. When a feud between two woodcutter families threatened to ignite into violence over a stolen axe, it was Elspitt who intervened, not with sermons but with symbolism. She served them tea steeped with chamomile and meadowsweet, herbs known to soothe anger. "The forest thrives because the birch doesn't war with the pine," she murmured as they drank. By the time the cups were empty, the axe had been returned, and a marriage proposed between the families to seal the peace. Her true mastery lay in duality. Every plant in her arsenal had two uses: vervain for calming feverish brows or calming warlords' tempers, elderberry syrup for winter coughs or sweetening bitter negotiations. Even her rituals blurred lines. The same moonlit chant that consecrated her healing salves also hallowed oaths between enemies, their hands clasped over a bowl of soil she'd blessed. "Earth remembers," she'd say. "It drinks blood or it drinks rain, choose." The local bishop called her a pagan. The nobility dismissed her as a peasant superstition. But when the plague came, it was Elspitt's grove that became a refuge, not just for the sick, but for the desperate lords who'd run out of soldiers to command. She made them kneel in the dirt beside the very outcasts they'd scorned, handing them bandages instead of swords. "Healing has no borders," she told them, pressing rosemary into their palms, an herb for memory. A reminder that survival required more than force. It demanded humility. No chronicle mentions her, no parchment records her treaties. But if you walk those woods today, you'll find the descendants of those feuding families still trading cuttings from the elder tree she planted, their shared roots deeper than any grudge. In the candlelit chambers of Castile's royal court, where men drafted treaties with swords at their hips, Queen Maria of Aragon relied on a far subtler weapon, her confidante, Lady Beatrice de Silva. To the nobility, Beatrice was merely a skilled embroiderer, her hands always busy with needle and thread. But those intricate stitches held more than silk, they carried the fate of kingdoms. When tensions flared along the Portuguese border over disputed farmlands, it was Beatrice who traveled disguised as a pilgrim, her basket of unfinished tapestries hiding coded maps. The delicate roses stitched along the edges, they marked safe routes for messengers, the interlocking vines, a secret plea for patience from the queen. Her greatest act of diplomacy unfolded at a seemingly innocent gathering of noblewomen. While the men debated war in the next room, Beatrice unfurled an embroidery frame, her latest piece depicting two doves sharing an olive branch. The wives of the feuding lords leaned in, admiring the craftsmanship until one recognized her own family's crest woven subtly into the pattern. Beatrice hadn't just created art, she'd stitched a roadmap to peace, using symbols their husbands would understand but never suspect. By the time the real negotiations began, the women had already softened their men's resolve with whispers over the embroidery hoop. What made Beatrice so dangerous and so effective was how thoroughly she weaponized invisibility. The very skills that made her insignificant in the eyes of power, needlework, hospitality, the quiet tending of relationships became her tools of statecraft. Even her failures taught her, when a coded message was nearly intercepted, she switched to stitching prayers onto altar cloths, knowing priests would carry them unchecked across borders. "Thread is mightier than parchment," she once wrote to the queen, "for men guard their letters but let textiles pass through their fingers like air." Her legacy lingers in the most unexpected places. That famous 15th century altarpiece in Toledo Cathedral. Art historians praise its vibrant colors, but few notice the border's peculiar stitch pattern, a perfect replica of the treaty that ended the Castilian-Portuguese wheat wars. Beatrice signed her work where only the queen would look, in the minuscule knots forming the Virgin's robe. Textiles concealed more than messages, they cloaked entire lives. Consider the beguines of Flanders, laywomen who wove their faith into the very fabric of their cities. In the bustling trade hub of 15th century Bruges, where merchant guilds held more power than most nobles, Clara Vander Mirren turned her father's tapestry workshop into a silent revolution. To the wealthy patrons who commissioned her work, she was merely a skilled artisan, her fingers dancing across looms to create scenes of biblical heroes and pastoral idyls. But beneath the surface of those shimmering threads lay something far more subversive, a living map of Europe's shifting alliances woven in code, the golden fleur de lis in a saint's robe. A nod to France's secret negotiations with Burgundy, the peculiar arrangement of sheep in a countryside scene, coordinates for safe houses along the Rhine. Clara's genius lay in her audience. She sold her tapestries exclusively to the wives and daughters of powerful men, knowing their chambers were where real politics unfolded. A noblewoman might admire a hanging for its beauty while unconsciously memorizing the placement of embroidered doves, each one representing a city councillor ripe for persuasion. Even the colors held meaning. The rare Tyrian purple she reserved for border designs wasn't just a display of wealth, it signaled urgent messages, its dye so expensive that only crises justified its use. When the Duke of Gelderland's spies intercepted a letter warning of his planned rebellion, they found nothing incriminating, but his wife's new tapestry, delivered that very week, showed Joshua bringing down Jericho's walls, with the trumpet players' cloaks matching the livery of the Duke's would-be allies. Her most daring work came during the Hanseatic League's trade embargo. As ports froze and warehouses emptied, Clara wove an elaborate sea battle where every ship's sail bore the crest of a different merchant family. To the untrained eye, it was decorative chaos, but to the guild masters' wives who gathered for weekly embroidery circles, the tapestry revealed which cities were quietly breaking ranks, their ships subtly angled toward a hidden harbor stitched with silver thread. Within months, a black market network flourished, its routes traced in Clara's knots. Was art her true weapon? Perhaps, but her real power was patience. While men shouted in council halls, she spent years earning trust through flawless craftsmanship, until her workshop became the one place rivals lowered their guards. Even the church unwittingly aided her, blessing her devotional works that traveled farther than any courier. The final irony: when the Duke of Cleves needed proof of his enemy's collusion, he confiscated a tapestry from their castle, only to realize too late that the evidence had been hanging in his own hall for years, woven into the wedding gift Clara made for his daughter. Her legacy survives in fragments. That famous Garden of Earthly Delights in Brussels. Scholars still debate why certain flowers appear in impossible combinations, until you cross-reference them with a list of banned books smuggled into Flanders in 1496. Clara understood what few diplomats did. Sometimes the safest place to hide the truth is in plain sight, where only those trained to see it will look. In the shadow of Avignon's papal palace, where gold-leaf decrees dripped with hypocrisy, a voice rose from the cloistered silence, one sharp enough to pierce armor. Sister Margherita of San Sisto never raised a sword, but her quill was lethal. Disguised as Brother Marcus, she penned blistering tracts against the church's lavish excesses while famine gripped the countryside. Her monastery's scriptorium, ostensibly a place for copying psalms, became a forge for rebellion. Ink-stained fingers passed her pamphlets to merchants, who smuggled them inside bales of wool bound for Rome. The genius of her deception lay in its simplicity. Who would suspect a nun, her head bowed in apparent submission, of crafting the most scathing satire of the age? Her Sermon of the Hungry Sheep mocked cardinals as wolves in mitres, their bellies full while Christ's flock starved. The Pope's censors hunted Marcus for years, tearing apart university libraries, never thinking to search a women's choir stall. Margherita hid in plain sight, her Latin so polished that scholars assumed the author must be a Paris-trained theologian. Even her handwriting betrayed nothing. She taught 12 nuns to replicate the same bold strokes, creating a labyrinth of scribes to shield her. But anonymity was her armor, and history would strip it away. When the papal investigators finally traced the pamphlets to San Sisto, the abbess burned every incriminating manuscript, including Margherita's personal journal. What survived? A single line in a bishop's ledger. Silence imposed on certain disruptive sisters. No name, no crime, just the faintest ripple in parchment. Margherita's story teeters on the edge of oblivion because those who erase history know exactly where to press their thumbs. Yet fragments linger like the odd smudge on a 14th century psalter, where someone scraped away an underlayer of text too thoroughly. Hold it to the light just so, and you can almost see the ghost of her words. This vanishing act wasn't unique. For every Margherita, there were dozens more whose descent dissolved into dust. Which makes the next story all the more remarkable because she left proof. Bruges in the 14th century was a tinderbox, wealth from the wool trade piled high while weavers starved in the shadow of guild halls. When the looms fell, silent and angry mobs filled the streets. It wasn't a bishop or burgomaster who stepped between the factions, but a woman in a grey hood, Sister Caitlene of the Beguines. These laywomen, neither nuns nor wives, occupied a rare space of freedom answerable to no husband, no cloister, only their own collective conscience. And Caitlene wielded that independence like a shield. Her strategy was brilliance in simplicity. Each dawn, she led prayers in the beguinage courtyard, where both guild masters and starving apprentices could attend without losing face. Her sermons, thick with parables of unjust stewards and shared harvests, weren't just scripture, they were coded negotiation. Does the vine grow for the vintner alone? She'd ask, pouring wine for all present. The cup passed from calloused weavers' hands to the jeweled fingers of the guild dean, a silent reminder that thirst knew no class. But her real power lay in the beguines' unique position. The church tolerated them as pious women, the guilds respected their textile work, and the city relied on their hospitals. Caitlene exploited every thread of this trust. When talk stalled, she'd accidentally leave her ledger open in the infirmary, its pages detailing how much the strike cost the guilds in lost exports, figures too precise to ignore. When violence loomed, she sent beguine sisters through the streets with baskets of bread, forcing armed men to lower their clubs to accept charity from women they couldn't attack without scandal. The final masterstroke came during the Feast of St. Clare. Caitlene organized a procession where guild wives and weavers' daughters walked side by side, carrying a tapestry they'd woven together, its design a perfect balance of merchant ships and working hands. The bishop blessed it as a symbol of unity. The guilds couldn't reject it without insulting the church. By the time the men realized they'd been outmaneuvered, new wage agreements were drying in the sun beside the beguinage herb gardens. Caitline's story reveals a startling truth. Medieval cities, for all their oppression, created cracks where women could act. Narrow streets meant eyes everywhere, but also ears to hear a well-placed word. Crowded markets made anonymity possible. A hooded figure slipping between stalls could be anyone. And in Bruges, that figure was a woman who turned piety into a passport, moving freely where men were trapped by pride. This urban alchemy, where stone walls and bustling squares conspired to give women voice, wasn't unique to Flanders. Far to the east, in the labyrinthine streets of Constantinople, another woman would use the chaos of the city to hide her most audacious act yet. In the smoke-filled workshops of 15th-century Prague, where men sought to turn lead into gold, one alchemist pursued a far more elusive transformation, turning war into peace. Known only as Magister Clara in court records, she operated under the guise of a mere technician, her hands stained with mercury as she perfected alloys for royal mints. But the metals she manipulated were merely a facade. Her true alchemy lay in the invisible, using her laboratory as a stage where sworn enemies could meet, by chance, over vials of quicksilver. The ruse was elegant in its simplicity. Nobles flocked to her workshop, lured by rumors of her mastery over precious metals. What they didn't realize was that the real transmutation happened between the crucible and the cooling rack. A Hungarian envoy might linger to discuss silver purity just as a Polish ambassador arrived to inspect new coin dies. Clara's genius was in her timing. She'd vanished to fetch more charcoal, leaving rivals alone just long enough for conversation to spark. And when tensions flared, she'd intervene with a carefully dropped flask, the sudden spill forcing adversaries to work together, mopping up mercury, an element she called the Great Mediator for its ability to divide and reunite without residue. Her patrons believed they were exploiting her. The Holy Roman Emperor commissioned her to create a gold-like alloy for his treasury, never suspecting she was using the project to siphon intelligence. Each batch of metal she delivered came with a coded report hidden in the alloy's composition, the ratio of copper to zinc indicating which noble families were plotting rebellion. The Duke of Bavaria paid handsomely for her eternal torch recipe, unaware the phosphorescent mixture also illuminated secret passages where his own guards could be bribed. But Clara's masterpiece was her peace phial, a tiny glass ampoule she gifted to feuding lords. "Break this when war seems inevitable," she'd say, knowing the scented oil inside would release a fragrance identical to that of their childhood chapels, a sensory trigger to lower defenses. The contents were harmless, but the ritual worked. 5 recorded conflicts halted abruptly after her files shattered in council chambers, though chroniclers credited divine intervention. Did they ever grasp her true role? The answer lingers in a marginal note from a Nuremberg banker's ledger, paid to the Silver Witch for treaty wax. The wax in question sealed the very document that ended the Bohemian succession crisis. Clara had blended it with lavender and mother's milk, substances medieval science believed promoted concord. The lords signed without reading the ingredients, too busy admiring how the wax took their seals so clearly. History remembers her as a footnote, a purveyor of curiosities to the powerful. But in the quiet of her workshop, surrounded by bubbling alembics, she'd achieved what armies could not, proving sometimes the most potent diplomacy smells of sulfur and rosewater, and the surest path to peace is letting men believe they discovered it themselves. The death of a husband could mean disaster for a noblewoman unless she was Dame Alix de Montfort. Left a widow at 35 when her lord fell in battle, most expected her to fade into the cloistered life expected of grieving wives. Instead, she transformed his fortress monastery in the Pyrenees into something far more daring, a hub of diplomacy disguised as a pilgrimage site. To outsiders, Alix played her role perfectly. She wore the black veil of mourning, funded lavish altar pieces, and hosted feast days with such devotion that bishops praised her as a model of widowly virtue. But beneath that performance lay a web of influence stretching from Toulouse to Barcelona. Her monastery sat at the crossroads of 3 pilgrimage routes, its guest houses always filled with travelers, some genuine devotees, others couriers carrying encrypted messages in hollowed-out reliquaries. The same priests who blessed her chapel unknowingly smuggled treaties in their vestment chests, their holy office making them above suspicion. Her masterstroke was weaponizing grief. When the Count of Foix seized lands belonging to her neighbor, Alix invited both men to a memorial mass for her late husband. As they knelt side by side in forced civility, her choir sang a haunting plainsong, its lyrics subtly rewritten to recount the parable of the unjust steward. By the final verse, the Count was sweating under his fur-trimmed cloak. Within weeks, the disputed villages were returned, with chroniclers noting his sudden attack of conscience. Widowhood became her cloak of invisibility. While men jostled for power, she moved unchecked through the cracks of their pride. Who would suspect a woman in perpetual mourning of brokering the truce that ended the Bern succession crisis, or of training her novices to decipher battlefield reports hidden in illuminated psalters? Even her embroidery held secrets, the black thread of her mourning tapestries forming coded maps of mountain passes where mercenaries could be ambushed. The irony, the very laws designed to silence widows gave her freedom. Without a husband to control her assets, she managed estates like a lord. Without sons old enough to inherit, she ruled unchallenged. And in a world that pitied poor, bereaved Alix, no one noticed how often her prayers coincided with political miracles. Her story forces us to reconsider widowhood not as an ending, but a beginning, a door swinging open just as society assumed it had closed. For every woman pushed to the margins, history shows another turning those margins into a vantage point. And sometimes the best place to hide a revolution is in plain sight, draped in mourning veils and whispered between vespers. Which makes the next woman's strategy all the more striking because she didn't hide at all. Instead, she let the world watch as she performed the ultimate deception. In the great halls of 14th century Aquitaine, where lords feasted beneath banners stained with old blood, one woman turned song into salvation. They called her Jehan the Sweet-Voiced, a traveling minstrel whose lute seemed strung with silver and sorrow. Nobles welcomed her for the beauty of her ballads, never suspecting each melody carried a hidden plea for peace. Her true genius lay in the space between notes, the way a slowed tempo could soften a baron's glare, or a well-placed refrain might echo the grievances of his enemies. Music was her cipher. When singing of star-crossed lovers parted by war, she'd weave in the names of villages destroyed in recent raids. A cheerful tune about harvest festivals became a subtle reminder of crops rotting in fields while men fought. Even her instrument conspired in the deception. The lute's hollow body sometimes held scraps of parchment, passed to sympathetic ladies during requests for a favorite hymn. By the time anyone thought to question why disputes often cooled after her visits, Jehan was already riding toward the next castle, her saddlebags heavy with coins and fresh intelligence. Her boldest performance came at Château de Brayon, where two rival dukes sat stiffly at opposite ends of the hall. Jehan didn't sing of battle or glory that night. Instead, she offered The Lay of the Willow, a haunting tale of two knights who unknowingly mourned at the same grave, one weeping at dawn, the other at dusk. As the final chord faded, the younger duke stood abruptly, demanding private chambers. By morning, a truce was brokered, though chroniclers would later attribute it to a shared fondness for poetry. What made minstrels like Jehan so effective was their liminality. Neither servant nor noble, they floated between worlds, their artistry granting them access even as it rendered them invisible. A singer could voice truths that would earn a diplomat a dagger between the ribs, because who would silence music itself? And when words failed, melody could bypass reason entirely, stirring memories of childhood or lost loves, emotions far more potent than political arguments. This raises a chilling possibility. How many other peacemakers disguised their work as entertainment? The troubadour tradition brims with oddities, ballads where geographic details are suspiciously accurate, or lyrics that shift subtly between regions as if carrying adjustments to terms. Even the famous Song of Roland contains a curious verse about the queen who sang treaties into being, often dismissed as fantasy. But in the archives of Carcassonne, a crumbling ledger lists payments to one Marie La Chanteuse for services rendered during a siege that ended with inexplicable mercy. The entry is followed by an unusual doodle, a lute with a dove's head where the sound hole should be. Perhaps music's greatest power was its ephemerality. Unlike treaties that could be burned or messengers who could be silenced, a song once heard couldn't be unremembered. It slipped past gates and guard towers, humming in the minds of soldiers and scullions alike. And long after Jehan vanished into the footnotes of history, her melodies lingered, whistled by shepherds in valleys where battles never came, proof that sometimes the surest path to peace isn't through force or negotiation, but through a refrain so beautiful it makes war feel like sacrilege. The next woman needed no such subtlety. When the gates of Constantinople trembled under siege, she wielded a weapon far more shocking than song, one that left even emperors scrambling to obey. Behind the thick stone walls of a Norwich anchor-hold, where daylight barely pierced the arrow-slit window, Dame Julian's voice carried farther than any king's herald. Voluntarily sealed into a cell barely wider than her outstretched arms, this anchoress became the most improbable power broker of 15th century England. Pilgrims flocked to her tiny window, believing they sought spiritual solace, but among them came noblemen, merchants, and even the king's own confessor, all drawn by rumors of a woman who could see the future. Julian's genius was in her framing. When plague threatened London's trade routes, she didn't warn of divine wrath like other mystics. Instead, she described a vision of ships with black sails, bringing not pestilence but economic collapse, a calculated risk if the Hanseatic League withdrew its merchants. Her prophecies, carefully couched in religious symbolism, were in fact razor-sharp analyses of troop movements, harvest yields, and court alliances, gathered from the whispers of visitors and deftly repackaged as divine revelation. Even her famous declaration that all shall be well wasn't just comfort, it was a strategic reassurance to panicked lords during the peasants' revolt, preventing them from cracking down with excessive violence that would have radicalized the countryside further. Solitude became her weapon. While bishops debated theology in crowded councils, Julian's isolation lent her words an aura of unquestionable purity. The very act of being walled away, an existence most would find unbearable, made her advice seem untouchable by earthly corruption. Visitors left her cell believing they'd heard God's will, never realizing how meticulously she'd studied their facial tics and hesitant pauses, tailoring each revelation to steer them toward peace. Her surviving manuscripts hint at the deception. Between lines of mystical ecstasy, she notes which noble houses donated wool for her cloak, which abbots smelled of gunpowder from recent travels, which merchants' wives wept over sons pressed into military service. These weren't the jottings of a detached visionary, but the observations of a master strategist reading a kingdom through its wounds. What does it mean that history's most famous anchoress might have been its shrewdest politician, that a woman barred from stepping beyond her cell still shaped the fate of nations? Perhaps it proves that true influence needs no throne, only the wisdom to turn constraints into camouflage. And sometimes the most powerful place to stand is where no one thinks to look. Like the bottom of a well, in the narrow streets of 14th century Toledo, where the scent of saffron and olive oil mingled with the echoes of mosque calls and church bells, a woman named Rahul Bat Yosef turned her kitchen into a sanctuary of diplomacy. To her neighbors, she was simply a merchant's widow renowned for her almond-stuffed dates and honeyed egg bread. But behind her latticed windows, Rahul orchestrated something extraordinary. Clandestine gatherings where Christian scholars, Muslim jurists, and Jewish elders debated scripture not in confrontation but in verse. Her method was as subtle as the rosewater she stirred into her tea. When tensions flared over a disputed passage in the Psalms, she served platters of sambusak crisp pastries filled with chickpeas on one half, spiced lamb on the other, an edible reminder that two traditions could share one table. Disagreements over inheritance law dissolved over bowls of adafina, the slow-cooked Sabbath stew that Muslims called tajine and Christians admired as the patience of Job in a pot. And when words failed, Rahul would recite poetry in Ladino, Arabic, and Castilian, her voice weaving the languages together until even the most stubborn cleric leaned in to catch the echoes of their own sacred texts in her rhymes. One winter night, as snow silenced the city, her home nearly became a casualty of history. A mob incited by a firebrand preacher gathered outside, torches flickering against her door. But Rahul didn't bar the windows. Instead, she sent her daughter into the street with a tray of steaming buñuelos, the fried dough balls beloved by all three communities. "The night is cold," the girl said, offering them to the ringleader. "Will you burn the hands that fed your grandfather?" The torches wavered. By dawn, the crowd had dispersed, leaving behind only melted snow and the faint scent of cinnamon, proof that survival sometimes hinged on the memory of shared sweetness. Rahul left no written treaties, no grand declarations. Her legacy survives in recipes scribbled in margins, a note to add more honey when guests are bitter, or let the dough rise as long as a Pharisee's sermon. But the real testament to her work lies in the Toledo archives, where a rare document from 1384 records a property dispute resolved by the Council of the Women's Table. No names are given, but the ruling quotes a line of Hebrew poetry, one Rahul often recited to remind quarreling heirs that rivers forget they were rain when they reach the sea. How many other mediators like her were erased from the record? The answer might lie in the very spices that crossed borders so easily: cinnamon from Alexandria, saffron from Aragon, while the hands that blended them were scrubbed from history. We know the Inquisition later targeted Judaizing practices like these shared meals, condemning them as heresy. But in Rahul's time, before the fires of intolerance burned those bridges, a widow's kitchen could be the quietest crucible of peace. And sometimes the most powerful resistance wasn't defiance, but the stubborn act of setting an extra place at the table. In the dim glow of a noblewoman's birthing chamber, where even kings hesitated to intrude, the midwife held more power than any chancellor. Margaret of Provence moved through the highest circles of 13th century France with her linen satchel of herbs and birthing stools, her hands steeped in the most intimate moments of life and death. To the court, she was merely a skilled healer, her gossip dismissed as harmless chatter among women. But Margaret's whispered conversations were anything but idle. They were the threads that stitched together fragile alliances and unraveled plots before they could ignite. Her access was unparalleled. While diplomats cooled their heels in anterooms, Margaret glided past guards into the private chambers of queens and countesses, her presence unremarkable as she checked a pregnancy or soothed a colicky heir. The same hands that delivered babies also passed folded notes between feuding families, tucked into swaddling cloths or slipped beneath medicinal tonics. When the Duke of Anjou's wife confided her fears about his planned rebellion, Margaret didn't just offer calming tea, she sent word to the king's mistress through a network of wet nurses, ensuring the plot was quashed before swords could be drawn. The pardon that later spared the Duke's life, officially it was royal mercy. In truth, it bore the faint scent of lavender from Margaret's apothecary. The irony was exquisite. The very word gossip comes from God Sib, meaning godparent, a reminder that these women were once trusted witnesses to life's sacred thresholds. Margaret weaponized that trust. Her reports on which noblewomen bled excessively after childbirth revealed which families might soon lack heirs, information the crown used to redraw succession plans. Her casual remarks about a baron's wife craving pickled herring, a known craving for male heirs, sent rival lords scrambling to renegotiate marriage contracts. Even her herbal knowledge doubled as intelligence. A sudden demand for pennyroyal tea could signal an inconvenient pregnancy needing discreet resolution. But Margaret's greatest leverage lay in the unspoken rule of the birthing chamber. What happened there stayed there. When the Count of Champagne's son was born with a birthmark resembling the arms of a rival house, Margaret's swift repositioning of the infant and her steady gaze at the attending ladies ensured the secret died with them. In return, the Countess persuaded her husband to pardon a group of rebellious peasants Margaret favored. The midwife's ledger, confiscated by the Inquisition centuries later, contained cryptic notes like rosemary for Lady E, bay leaf for the treaty, and twins at Clermont tell the bishop. This was the paradox of women's work. Roles society deemed humble often granted unparalleled influence. The same hands that cradle life could steer the fates of kingdoms, and the whispers dismissed as feminine frivolity sometimes held the weight of treaties. Margaret's story forces us to reconsider every historical footnote about women's gossip. How many wars were averted or ignited by words exchanged over embroidery hoops or birthing beds? How many pardons were really brokered not in throne rooms, but in the quiet spaces where men seldom thought to listen? That invisibility became its own kind of armor. While Margot's male counterparts in diplomacy faced daggers or dungeons, she moved untouched, her power cloaked in the assumption that a midwife's world was small, her concerns domestic. Even the church, so wary of women's influence, couldn't interfere without violating the sanctity of childbirth. By the time the king's spies realized how much she knew, Margot had already retired to a countryside herb garden, her secrets buried like roots beneath the soil, waiting to sprout in ways no one could predict. Which makes the next woman's strategy all the more daring, because she didn't hide in private chambers, but turned the most public space of all into her stage. The waves off the coast of 14th century Brittany knew no law but the wind until they met Jean de Clisson. Once a noblewoman, then a widow seeking vengeance, she became the most feared pirate of her age, her black-sailed ships striking terror into the hearts of French captains. But history remembers only half her story. Behind the legend of the Lioness of Brittany, who hung her enemies from the mast, lay a woman who turned her infamy into the ultimate bargaining chip. Jean's transformation began with a calculated gamble. After years of plundering, she realized something startling. The same ports that barred their gates against her fleets would open them for negotiation when she held their sons captive. Unlike male pirates who ransomed prisoners for gold, Jean demanded something far more valuable: peace treaties. Her strategy was brutal in its simplicity. Capture a nobleman's heir, then offer his life in exchange for a ceasefire between warring coastal towns. The French crown, desperate to stop her raids, never suspected she was playing both sides, using her outlaw status to force compromises no legitimate envoy could broker. The records are sparse, but one incident survives in a Breton monk's chronicle. When two fishing villages escalated a dispute into naval skirmishes that threatened trade routes, Jean intervened not with swords but with ledgers. She kidnapped both mayor's sons, then hosted them aboard her flagship under a curious condition: the boys would share a cabin until their fathers settled the feud. For weeks, the children dined together, played chess, and forged a friendship their elders couldn't ignore. When the mayors finally met on Jean's deck to retrieve their sons, the boys begged them to reconcile. The resulting truce lasted 20 years, though the scroll bore only the mayor's seals. Jean's name appeared nowhere. Even her violence served a purpose. The infamous red deck of her flagship, painted with the blood of corrupt officials, became a warning to nobles who broke agreements she'd brokered. Local fishermen whispered that crossing the lioness in battle meant death, but crossing her word after a truce meant damnation. By the time the French court realized she'd become an unofficial maritime arbiter, it was too late. Her network of informants stretched from Dover to Gibraltar, her loyalty to no crown making her the only neutral party pirates and kings would both tolerate. The ultimate irony: in her later years, retired to an English castle, Jean trained other women in navigation and code breaking. A ship's rudder and a treaty's clause turn on the same principle, she reportedly told them. Control the angle and you control the current. Her pupils would go on to mediate conflicts from Calais to Cyprus, their methods eerily similar to hers, though none carried the pirate's brand that had both constrained and freed her. This blurring of roles, outlaw and peacemaker, predator and protector, wasn't unique to Jean. In the very courts that condemned her, another woman was proving that the line between criminal and diplomat wasn't just thin, it was imaginary. The wheat fields of Burgundy in 1348 should have been golden with plenty, but instead they were trampled under the boots of soldiers. Two rival lords, locked in a petty feud over hunting rights, had turned their rage on the peasants, seizing harvests to starve each other's subjects. In the village of Montreux, a woman named Parette did something unthinkable. She walked into the middle of a skirmish with nothing but a loaf of bread and a child on her hip. Her protest was deceptively simple: As armored men clashed around her, she began tearing the loaf into pieces, handing chunks to soldiers from both sides. "Eat," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "This is the last of my flour. When it's gone, my children will lick the stones." The gesture shouldn't have mattered, peasants pleaded with lords every day. But Perrette's timing was lethal. She'd chosen the feast day of Saint Michael, when even warriors were meant to fast in humility, and she'd brought her youngest, a girl whose sunken cheeks mirrored the famine creeping across the region. The lords, shamed by her quiet defiance, called a truce, not out of mercy but strategy. Starving peasants couldn't pay taxes or sow next year's crops. What made Perrette dangerous wasn't just her courage, it was how she weaponized maternal virtue. By framing her protest as a mother's plea rather than a rebel's demand, she gave the nobility an excuse to back down without losing face. Chroniclers later credited the peace to the lords' Christian charity, but the village's oral tradition remembered the truth. It was the day a farmer's wife fed an army to remind them who really kept the kingdom alive. This wasn't an isolated act. Across medieval Europe, peasant women leveraged their supposed meekness to intervene in ways men couldn't. A group of wives in Flanders once ended a siege by marching into the crossfire with baskets of bread, daring the besiegers to strike unarmed women. In Lombardy, a dairymaid brokered a ceasefire by leading her cows between battle lines. No lord would slaughter valuable livestock. These women understood something their rulers didn't. Survival was a language everyone spoke, and hunger made even knights listen. Perrette's story forces us to reconsider how history records resistance. We have volumes on kings' treaties, but only fragments of the moments when ordinary women used their only weapons, a loaf, a child, the unbearable weight of moral clarity, to bend the arc of power. How many truces began not in throne rooms, but in the spaces where the mighty had to look the starving in the eye? The answer might lie in the quietest rebellion of all. The way village midwives sometimes named babies Pax or Concordia, in years when wars mysteriously ended, stitching hope into the very fabric of the future. In the candlelit solitude of her alpine hermitage, Sister Ursula of the Snows drew visions no one else could see, or so her devotees believed. Pilgrims trekked through mountain passes to witness the mystic trace intricate patterns in the frost on her cell's walls, her fingers moving as if guided by angels. What they didn't realize was that the celestial maps she claimed revealed the bonds between souls were something far more earthly, a coded web of alliances between the very lords kneeling at her feet. Her method was as audacious as it was subtle. Each noble visitor received a personalized soul chart, its swirling lines connecting them to others in their spiritual family. The Duke of Carinthia marveled at how his chart linked him to a rival runner, where the intersecting arcs mirrored their shared interest in Bohemian silver mines. A feuding Italian countess wept over connections to a neighbor she'd sworn to hate, not recognizing the pattern as a trade route their families desperately needed to share. Ursula's genius lay in reframing cold strategy as divine will. When two barons discovered their charts formed a perfect circle when placed together, they took it as a sign from God to end their war. Only later would historians note the circle's dimensions matched the disputed borderlands between their territories. Her followers became unwitting diplomats. Lords who'd never share a feast hall found themselves exchanging soul readings at her bidding, the parchment in their hands subtly highlighting mutual enemies or resource shortages. Even the church endorsed her, interpreting her diagrams as evidence of heavenly harmony, never noticing how often her visions aligned with papal political needs. The final stroke came when Ursula divined that all present should fast together on the eve of St. Mark's feast. The resulting gathering of rivals, hungry and humbled in the same chapel, became the unlikely birthplace of the Alpine Grain Pact. But was Ursula a fraud? Her journals, discovered centuries later in a monastery attic, suggest otherwise. Between prayers, she'd scribbled notes on crop yields, inheritance disputes, even the preferred wines of visiting nobles, information gathered from pilgrims' confessions. Her maps weren't lies but translations. The soul and the state are mirrors, she wrote. To heal one, I must trace the wounds of the other. This blurring of mysticism and strategy wasn't unique. In fact, it paled next to the audacity of our next figure, a woman who didn't just map alliances but manufactured them from whole cloth, using the most unexpected tool of all, counterfeit relics. The shimmering glassworks of 14th century Venice were famous for their delicate beauty, but no one suspected the secrets hidden in their imperfections. Guild mistress Giovanna della Quercia ran the most prestigious glasshouse on Murano, where artisans crafted goblets so fine they were said to shatter at a liar's touch. What the Doge and his merchants never realized was that Giovanna's true masterpiece wasn't the glass itself, but the flaws she engineered into every piece. Her system was as ingenious as it was invisible. A wine glass with a barely noticeable bubble at the stem's base signaled a message needed urgent delivery. A vase with subtly uneven thickness along its rim contained tiny parchment rolls tucked inside the glass layers, visible only when held to candlelight. Even the colors held meaning: cobalt for maritime disputes, ruby for papal interventions, emerald for agricultural treaties. While rivals guarded their techniques to prevent imitation, Giovanna deliberately leaked flawed designs to competitors, knowing they'd replicate the errors, and unwittingly spread her coded vessels across Europe's courts. The fragility of her trade became its greatest asset. When the Duke of Milan's envoy smashed a goblet during tense negotiations with Florence, the servants sweeping up the shards found slivers of glass etched with treaty terms, an accident staged to force the Duke's hand. Another time, Giovanna herself tripped while presenting a newly commissioned service to the Venetian council, the shattered pieces revealing maps of Ottoman troop movements hidden in the gilding. Glass remembers what men choose to forget. She'd tell her apprentices as they gathered the fragments. Her workshops doubled as training grounds for the most unlikely diplomats, glassblowers who learned to read tensions in a noble's grip on a cup, glaziers who mixed metallic oxides not just for color, but to make certain pieces sing at precise pitches when tapped, creating musical codes. Even the furnace workers played their part, adjusting temperatures to control how quickly blown glass would fracture, timing breaks to coincide with couriers' arrivals. The ultimate testament to her craft came during the War of the Bucket, when rival cities Bologna and Modena teetered on the brink over a stolen well pail. Giovanna sent each council an identical set of crystal bowls so perfectly matched that when placed together they formed a seamless sphere. The accompanying note reads simply, "What one breaks, both lose." The bowls still sit in the Twin City halls today, their surfaces scratched from centuries of being ritually touched whenever tensions flare, a tactile reminder that some bonds, like glass, are strongest when recognized as fragile. This marriage of craft and cunning wasn't unique. In fact, it paled next to the audacity of our next figure, a woman who didn't just conceal messages in objects, but turned the very books of the church into vehicles for revolt. The tournament grounds of 12th century Brabant should have been a bloodbath, knights jousting for glory, their lances tipped with razor-sharp steel, their tempers as volatile as the crowds cheering them on. But something peculiar happened under the rule of Duchess Marie de Champagne. The lists grew safer, the injuries fewer, and the grudges between competing lords mysteriously dissolved. The Secret, a little manuscript titled The Book of Chivalry, its pages dripping with the kind of noble ideals that made violent men nod along, never realizing they were being tamed. Marie's brilliance was in her framing. She didn't command knights to stop brawling. She convinced them it was beneath them. Her code redefined honor not as conquest but as restraint. A true knight, she wrote, would sooner surrender his sword than strike a defenseless foe. Tournaments became her testing ground. Where once competitors fought to maim, now they earned points for grace, control, and most tellingly for sparing opponents. The Duchess even introduced a court of love to judge disputes, its panel of noblewomen awarding prizes not to the strongest fighter, but to the one who showed the most mercy. Behind the pageantry, Marie's strategy was ruthlessly practical. Each tournament's guest list was carefully curated feuding lords placed on the same team, their squires sharing tents. The rules demanded they dine together the night before competing, their weapons locked away until dawn, and the prizes, lands once held by rivals, now granted conditionally, keep the peace or forfeit everything. Chroniclers marveled at how quickly old enemies became brothers in arms, never noticing the Duchess's scribes documenting every handshake, every toast, turning camaraderie into binding contracts. Did anyone suspect, perhaps a few, when the Count of Flanders grumbled that tournaments had grown soft as a lady's sewing circle, Marie sent him a beautifully illuminated copy of her book, with his own family's violent exploits discreetly inked out. He never criticized her again. By the time poets began spinning tales of King Arthur's Round Table, Marie's vision of chivalry had already rewritten reality, one blunted lance at a time. The ultimate irony, centuries later, historians would praise medieval knights for their innate sense of fair play, never tracing it back to a woman who understood the most effective reforms aren't enforced, they're performed. In the shadowed alleys of 14th century Montpellier, where physicians debated humors in Latin and witches were whispered about in the marketplace, an apothecary named Isabeau de Fournier kept a ledger that would have terrified kings had they known how to read it. To the sick who came for her fever tonics and the lovelorn who sought her aphrodisiacs, she was simply a skilled herbalist. But behind her shelves of neatly labeled jars lay a darker trade, vials of reconciliation bitters, their ingredients harmless but their effects revolutionary. A few drops in a shared cup could make the most hot-tempered baron forget why he despised his neighbor, not through magic, but through a shrewd understanding of how valerian root and honey smoothed frayed nerves when paired with carefully timed gossip. Isabeau's true power came from duality. The same hands that ground poppy tears for dying patients also knew which mushrooms could stop a man's heart without trace. This knowledge gave her quiet leverage over the warlords who sought her poisons for their daggers. When the Count of Toulouse demanded a tasteless toxin to silence a rival, she provided it alongside a tincture that induced only temporary paralysis. The rival awoke hours later in a monastery, a note pinned to his robe. "Your wife's dowry lands have been returned. Perhaps gratitude is stronger than vengeance." The Count, believing his enemy dead, signed a treaty with the man's heirs only to collapse in shock when the corpse walked into the negotiations. Isabeau's invoice for that service survives in a merchant's archive, itemized between rosewater and saffron. For peace, double the usual rate. Her workshop became neutral ground for the most unlikely encounters. Rival knights, both secretly suffering from the same embarrassing rash, would find themselves seated side by side on her oak bench as she applied salve, their mutual discomfort dissolving into laughter. A bishop and a heretic, each sent poisoned wine by the other, arrived separately for antidotes only to discover Isabeau had brewed a single shared remedy. "The dose is measured for two," she'd say, handing them one cup. "Drink together or not at all." The line between healer and harm was one she danced along with precision. When the Duke of Aquitaine's men ransacked a village suspected of sheltering rebels, Isabeau appeared with baskets of wound salve, a mixture so laced with laxatives that the soldiers spent the next week too weak to lift their swords. Yet she saved her true artistry for the ledger's hidden pages, where next to each poisoned sail she noted an antidote's recipient. The pattern is unmistakable. For every dose of death she sold, she ensured someone nearby held the cure. This delicate balance of threat and remedy shaped an entire region's politics. Lords who might have ordered massacres hesitated, knowing the apothecary who supplied their kitchens also stocked their enemies' medicine chests. Even the church, which burned women for far lesser knowledge, turned a blind eye because Isabeau kept the archbishop's migraines at bay with a special tisane whose second ingredient was silence. What does it mean that peace sometimes grew from the same soil as poison? That a woman who trafficked in death also held the threads of survival? Perhaps it's proof that the darkest tools can cast the brightest light, when wielded by hands wise enough to know when to heal and when to threaten, but never confuse the two. And sometimes the most potent medicines weren't brewed in cauldrons at all, but in the pages of books where another woman turned ink into a different kind of antidote. The scriptorium of Cluny Abbey in the 12th century was a place of quiet discipline, where monks bent over parchment with ink-stained fingers, recording history as it unfolded. But one scribe was no monk. Hidden among them, Sister Agnes of Vézelay worked with a different purpose, not merely to document wars, but to rewrite their endings before the ink dried. Her chronicles, now scattered across European archives, tell a curious tale. Battles that contemporary accounts described as bloodbaths appear in her hand as misunderstandings swiftly resolved. Feuds lasting generations shrink to mere footnotes. Even the most vicious kings emerge from her quill as flawed but redeemable men, their worst excesses softened by her strategic omissions. Agnes's genius lay in her subtlety. She didn't erase conflicts entirely that would have drawn suspicion. Instead, she shifted emphasis. A lord's massacre of peasants became unfortunate excesses during a time of famine. A burned village was recast as relocated due to strategic necessity. Her most daring edit came in the wake of a failed rebellion, where she inserted an entirely fictional scene of the rebel leader kneeling in contrition before the king, a scene so poignant that later scribes copied it verbatim, and the real rebel, shamed by the narrative, eventually surrendered on those same terms. The power of her work lay in its anonymity. As a woman, her presence in the scriptorium was already irregular, but her plain script and unadorned Latin drew no attention. Who would suspect a mere copyist of shaping the canon? Yet her edits rippled across centuries. When two noble families disputing a border pulled ancient chronicles as evidence, they found only Agnes's sanitized versions, and lacking proof of ancestral grievances, they settled peacefully. Even the church unwittingly propagated her vision, quoting her balanced accounts in sermons urging reconciliation. Her sole surviving personal note, tucked inside a psalter, hints at her mission. To write history is to plant seeds. Let the harvest be peace, but the true testament to her craft lies in the gaps. Where other monasteries' records bristle with vendettas, Cluny's archives breathe an unusual air of compromise, as if the very parchment conspired to mend what men had torn. This quiet rewriting of reality pales next to the audacity of our final figure, a woman who didn't just alter records, but forged an entire identity to stop a war. At first glance, Lady Elena of Aquitaine's falconry school seemed like an extravagant diversion, a place where noble women passed idle hours training peregrines to hunt. But the truth was far more cunning. Behind the silk-gloved hands and jeweled hoods, Elena was running the most exclusive diplomatic academy in medieval Europe. Her students didn't just learn to handle birds, they mastered the art of reading subtle shifts in posture, the patience to wait for the perfect moment to strike, and the wisdom to know when to loosen the jesses. A falcon never forces its prey, she'd murmur as her pupils practiced lure calls. It lets the wind do half the work, the parallels were deliberate. A goshawk's sudden dive became a lesson in calculated confrontation, how to apply pressure without provoking panic. The way a merlin returned to the glove only after circling taught the value of allowing adversaries to save face. Even the birds feeding rituals held meaning. Elena insisted her students hand feed their falcons daily, a reminder that even the fiercest opponent could be swayed by consistent gestures of trust. Her most brilliant tactic was the broken wing exercise. Students would watch as a falcon pretended injury to lure prey closer, then discuss how feigning vulnerability could disarm hostile negotiations. When the Count of Toulouse arrived boasting of his battle plans, Elena's star pupil, his own daughter, used the technique flawlessly, sighing over how exhausted the countryside must be from his campaigns. The Count left the next morning, his war chest still locked. The school's reputation for frivolity became its greatest asset. Men dismissed it as feminine folly, never suspecting the parchments tucked beneath embroidery frames were draft treaties, or that the hunting trips were rehearsals for intercepting rival couriers. By the time Elena's graduates began brokering peace accords from Navarre to Normandy, their successes were credited to natural wit, as if diplomacy were instinct, not the result of years training with creatures that could slice a hand open yet still return to the wrist when called. This raises a tantalizing question: how many other ladylike pursuits were covers for political education? The lace-making circles of Flanders, where intricate knotwork mirrored treaty clauses. The perfume distilleries of Provence, where scent recipes doubled as coded messages about royal alliances. Even the humble herb garden, where the placement of rosemary for remembrance or thyme for courage could signal which way a lord's wife leaned on contentious issues. Elena's legacy lingers in the oddest places. That famed tapestry in Château de Blois showing a falconer with a scroll in her glove. Art historians call it an artistic flourish. But in the margin, barely visible, stitches form the words, "The wise handler knows sometimes the leash must slacken to hold fast," a truth as applicable to statecraft as falconry, and proof that the best teachers often let their students fly beyond sight before revealing how thoroughly they've been trained. The alehouse of Goethe of Bruges smelled of hops and hearth smoke, its rough-hewn tables scarred by tankards and dagger tips, yet it became the unlikeliest peace hall of 14th century Flanders. To rowdy merchants and weary soldiers, she was just another brewer, her famed barley ale strong enough to make a monk sing and a knight confess. But those who lingered past last call witnessed something extraordinary. Rival lords hunched over her back table, their hands clasped not around swords but around steaming mugs of her honeyed mead. Goethe's secret: every round served was a step toward reconciliation, and every seemingly drunken ballad sung by her daughters carried the fine print of treaties in their rhymes. Hospitality was her weapon. By medieval custom, no violence could stain the threshold of a host who'd shared bread and salt, a rule Goethe exploited with precision. When the Duke of Brabant's men brawled with Flemish wool merchants over tariffs, she didn't call the guards. Instead, she slammed a frothing pitcher between them and declared the next round free if they could agree on the price. Laughter loosened tongues. By dawn, a compromise was scrawled in ale stains on her ledger. Even the church tacitly endorsed her methods, turning a blind eye to her unlicensed tavern because her sinful establishment had quelled more feuds than a dozen bishops. But the real genius lay in her ballads. Goethe's daughters would weave treaty terms into drinking songs, their melodies catchy enough that even illiterate mercenaries could memorize them. A tune about a jilted lover might encode border adjustments in its chorus, while a raucous ode to a stolen cow slyly listed reparations. The lords, too drunk to notice their secrets slipping into verse, would wake to find the entire town humming the terms, making denial impossible. One surviving scrap of parchment from a Ghent archive records a land dispute resolved per Cantal nom Goethe by Goethe's song, proving how thoroughly music could bind where parchment might tear. Her tavern became a living ledger of hidden diplomacy. The tally sticks behind her bar didn't just track ale debts, their notches marked which lords had honored agreements, their length indicating the severity of breaches. The hearth's mantle held a row of clay cups, each painted with a noble house's crest. Turned right side up, they signaled truces, while upside down meant trouble brewing. Even the sawdust on the floor played its part, its patterns swept into symbols by her barmaids to warn patrons which topics were safe to broach. This was the paradox of medieval women's spaces. Places dismissed as vulgar or frivolous often held the keys to power. While men postured in council chambers, Goethe's alehouse and countless kitchens, market stalls, and birthing rooms like it became the quiet engines of peace. The very things that made these spaces seem insignificant to chroniclers, their noise, their mess, their refusal to follow formal rules, were what made them effective. When a duke couldn't be seen bowing to a rival in court, he could always, accidentally, bump into him at Goethe's counter and blame the resulting handshake on good ale. The legacy of such women lingers in the oddest places. Next time you hear a drinking song with suspiciously specific lyrics, or notice how a pub's regulars fall silent when certain topics arise, remember, the echoes of Goethe's diplomacy might still be flowing, as potent and heady as her long-lost barrels of honey mead. And if that seems far-fetched, consider how many modern peace talks still happen over whiskey, rather than war rooms, proof that some strategies transcend centuries, even if their architects vanish from the record. Which makes the next woman's strategy all the more startling, because she didn't just host negotiations, but smuggled them inside the very symbols of oppression. Beneath the towering walls of Strasbourg's cathedral, where pilgrims flocked to gawk at holy relics, Sister Hildegard's cloister garden grew something far more miraculous: peace. To the bishops who sniffed at her simple herb lore, she was just another nun tending rosemary and rue, but those who stepped past her ivy-choked gate entered a living cipher. Every plant held meaning: lavender for truce, chamomile for compromise, thorny brambles marking boundaries no lord should cross. Her beds weren't just medicine, they were a silent language, their arrangements shifting like treaty terms. When warring barons came seeking salves for battle wounds, she'd send them home with cuttings of intertwined sage and thyme, a living reminder that some roots grow stronger when tangled. Her genius lay in making diplomacy feel like folklore. A dispute over river rights might end with each party planting willow saplings on opposite banks, their branches destined to meet midstream. A feud between knights dissolved after she served them tea from the same mint patch, its leaves stamped with their combined crests. Even the church unwittingly played along, blessing her harmony gardens as pious works, never noticing how often they sprouted near contested borders. The key was plausible deniability. When the Margrave of Baden accused her of meddling in politics, Hildegard merely gestured to her parsley rose and murmured, "The earth teaches patience, my lord." Even bitter roots sweeten with time, but her masterstroke was seasonal. Spring plantings coincided with troop musters, summer harvests with truce negotiations. By autumn, feuding families would find themselves sharing baskets of the same grapes, their vines deliberately interwoven, and winter, That's when her dried herbs traveled farthest, their sachets tucked inside diplomatic pouches. A certain blend of lemon balm and marjoram became infamous among couriers drunk before talks. It eased tensions just enough for compromises to take root. The garden's true power was its invisibility to history. No chronicler recorded the day Strasbourg's bishop and the city's rebel guilds settled their differences while kneeling to weed Hildegard's strawberry beds. But the municipal archives note an odd detail. The final agreement was sealed with a wax imprint of a cinquefoil leaf, the very symbol she used to mark reconciliation plots. Centuries later, botanists would puzzle over the cathedral garden's peculiar plant pairings, unaware they were staring at the fossilized remains of a peace process. This silent cultivation of harmony wasn't unique. From the olive groves of Tuscany to the castle-top herbariums of Wales, women used nature's rhythms to soften human discord. Because while kings could burn documents and banquets could sour, a well-tended garden kept its own time, and its lessons lingered like the scent of crushed lavender on a diplomat's sleeve. Which makes the final woman's strategy all the more poetic because she didn't just borrow nature's language, she let the land itself speak. The stone arches of the Pont d'Avignon still stand today, their curves mirrored in the Rhone's waters, but few know the hand that financed their construction belonged to a widow named Blanche of Provence. After her merchant husband's death left her with a fortune and no male heir, Blanche faced a choice: retreat into pious obscurity or wield her gold like mortar. She chose the latter, disguising her ambition beneath the cloak of charity. For the salvation of my husband's soul, she declared, she would build bridges where only fairies had dared to cross. The bishops blessed her project, never suspecting her true aim wasn't heavenly merit, but tethering warring towns to each other by stone and necessity. Her strategy was as solid as the limestone blocks her masons laid. By funding a bridge between feuding Avignon and Villeneuve, she forced interdependence. The tolls collected on one side funded repairs on the other, binding the towns in a cycle of shared profit. When bandits threatened construction, she hired guards from both communities, their pay contingent on mutual cooperation. Even the bridge's chapel, ostensibly a place for travelers to pray, became neutral ground where mayors could meet, by chance, during feast days, Blanche's masterstroke. Commissioning statues of saints beloved by both towns to flank the span, their watchful stone eyes making vandalism unthinkable, but her philanthropy hid sharper calculations. The bridge's arches were deliberately spaced to accommodate trading barges but not warships, throttling military escalation. The cobbled approaches funneled travelers past shared market stalls, where rival vendors soon found their wares entangled in the same ledgers. And when winter floods damaged the structure, Blanche insisted on joint repair crews, knowing shared labor would forge grudging respect. A bridge, she wrote in her ledger, is but a quarrel turned sideways. Her influence rippled beyond the Rhone. Inspired by her success, a circle of noble widows began funding similar projects, a sisterhood of stone and lime, connecting hostile territories under the guise of devotional works. In Lombardy, Lady Antonia financed an aqueduct that quenched two rival cities' thirst, its maintenance contracts requiring annual meetings between councils. Along the Rhine, Dame Hedwig rebuilt a collapsed bridge with one peculiar condition. The oath of peace had to be renewed each year by the mayor's children, tying the next generation to the truce. This raises a tantalizing question. How much of medieval Europe's infrastructure was secretly diplomacy by another name? The pilgrim roads that forced warring lords to guarantee safe passage, the irrigation canals that made upstream and downstream villages share water rights, even the bell towers whose chimes synchronized harvests across contested valleys. Each stone carried whispers of women who understood that to change the flow of conflict, you must first redirect its currents. Blanche's bridges didn't just span rivers, they vaulted over centuries of grievances, proving that sometimes the most enduring peace treaties aren't written on parchment, but etched into the landscape itself. And if you listen closely, the stones still speak. That odd hum when wind rushes through Pont d'Avignon's arches. Locals call it Blanche's whisper, a reminder that what men wage war over, women might just weave into something unbreakable. The convent of Santa Lucia stood silent under the Tuscan moon, its whitewashed walls glowing like a beacon, though not for the reason its bishops believed. To the outside world, Mother Giovanna was the picture of monastic obedience, her days spent in prayer and her nights in quiet contemplation. But behind the heavy oak doors of the cloister's storerooms, a different kind of devotion unfolded. Barrels of sacramental wine held forged travel papers beneath their corks, sacks of flour concealed spare clothing, and the hollowed-out statues of saints cradled maps of mountain escape routes. When the Duke of Milan's armies swept through the region, burning villages suspected of harboring rebels, Giovanna didn't just offer sanctuary, she weaponized the church's own protections. Convents were legally inviolate, even soldiers hesitated to violate holy ground, so she stretched the definition of holy ground to its limits. The chapel's crypt became a dormitory, the linen closets turned into sick bays, and the vegetable garden's trellises supported drying laundry that just happened to bear the colors of outlawed factions. Her greatest trick, teaching refugees to chant the offices in perfect Latin, their voices blending seamlessly with the sisters during surprise inspections. Charity is our mandate, she'd remind the visiting bishop, while behind him, a novice scrubbing the floor bore the calloused hands of a blacksmith and the haunted eyes of a deserter. But Giovanna's compassion had teeth. When supply wagons bound for the Duke's garrison passed through town, her convent's famed cherry liqueur, gifted to the officers as a gesture of goodwill, sometimes arrived laced with mild laxatives. More than one military campaign stalled because half the troops were too busy in the latrines to march. Other times, her network of sympathetic bakers would accidentally misdirect shipments of hardtack to refugee hideouts instead of barracks, their flour sacks marked with tiny crosses only her allies could read. The cost of such defiance came due on a frost-laced December morning. Soldiers finally stormed the convent, not for harboring fugitives, but on trumped-up charges of heresy, a pretext to bypass ecclesiastical immunity. They found no rebels, only Giovanna kneeling at the altar, her hands folded around a rosary with beads carved from cherry pits. The refugees had vanished days earlier, guided to safety by a route even she didn't know, planned by her subordinates in case of this moment. Her trial was a spectacle meant to terrify, but when the judges demanded names of accomplices, Giovanna smiled and recited the rule of Saint Benedict: to bear wrongs patiently is to triumph over them. The Duke, fearing martyrdom would make her a symbol, commuted her sentence to life imprisonment in her own convent under guard, a hollow victory. The sisters continued her work in whispers, their habits hiding more than vows. And the cherry trees in the cloister garden, their fruit grew strangely bitter after that winter, as if the very soil remembered. This quiet war of mercy wasn't unique. Across Europe, convents became covert arteries of resistance, their piety a shield for the powerless. But for every Giovanna who survived, how many were broken? The question lingers like incense in an empty chapel, a reminder that compassion in dark times is never without cost, which makes our final story all the more remarkable because she paid that price willingly, trading not just safety, but her very name, to prove that some flames can't be extinguished, only hidden. History remembers Queen Constance of Sicily as a shadow, a figure draped in silence, her lips sealed while men waged wars in her name. But in the archives of Palermo, a different story whispers through the parchment. This was no passive pawn. Her silence was a weapon honed to razor sharpness. In a court where every noble's voice clamored to be heard, Constance mastered the art of strategic reticence, turning her scarcity of words into a thunderclap when she chose to speak. Take the infamous Feast of the Broken Vow. When her husband, King Henry, arrogantly promised Sicilian lands to German lords without her counsel, Constance didn't protest. She simply arrived at the banquet in unadorned linen, the traditional garb of Sicilian widows. The message was unmistakable: cross me, and you rule a kingdom in mourning. Henry hastily amended his decree, while the chroniclers, baffled, attributed his change of heart to sudden piety. Her restraint extended to diplomacy. While ambassadors droned on with flattery and threats, Constance would listen for hours without reaction, her embroidery needle moving steadily until she'd puncture the tension with a single calibrated phrase. To the Pope's envoy demanding concessions, she murmured, "Does His Holiness sew his own robes?" The implication that governance required hands-on care forced the envoy into stammering retreat. Even her tears were tactical. During a rebellion, she allowed herself to be seen weeping at Mass just once, her grief so meticulously timed that it galvanized the city's loyalty overnight. The brilliance of her silence lay in its ambiguity. It forced others to project their fears onto her. Was her downturned gaze humility or contempt? Was her refusal to attend a war council indifference, or a silent condemnation of its folly? By the time her rivals realized they'd been outmaneuvered, Constance had already archived their mistakes in the margins of her psalter, notes later found to contain eerily accurate predictions of their downfalls. What unites Constance with the 24 women we've uncovered? Not just courage or cunning, but a shared understanding of power's illusions. They recognize that influence often thrives in the margins, in the spaces society assumes are empty. The abbess's cloister, the midwife's satchel, the minstrel's ballad, the widow's mourning veil, each was a blind spot men dismissed, and thus the perfect place to reshape the world. Their stories aren't footnotes, they're counter-narratives that force us to reread history between the lines. Because when a queen's silence speaks louder than a king's decree, or a nun's garden grows treaties alongside time, it proves the past is far more textured than we've been taught. The real question isn't why these women were forgotten, it's what else we're missing because we've been trained to see only the swords, not the hands that quietly sheathed them. What bound these women together wasn't just defiance, it was a profound understanding of how power truly moves in the shadows. Spirituality gave them cover, secrecy gave them space, and subversion became their shared language. The abbess whispering scripture while slipping a treaty into a bishop's sleeve, the midwife mixing tinctures and brokering truces, the widow turning her mourning veil into a cloak for diplomacy. Each found the cracks in a system that claimed to have no room for them. And through those cracks, they reshaped empires. This isn't just about adding forgotten names to the historical record. It's about dismantling the myth that medieval power flowed only through swords and crowns. Real influence often happened offstage, in the scriptorium where a nun's quill softened a king's legacy, in the tavern where a brewer's song encoded peace terms, in the garden where herbs spelled out alliances in roots and petals. These women didn't just navigate the margins, they turned them into a throne room of their own making. Their legacy challenges us to rethink how history gets written. For centuries, chroniclers framed their world as a chessboard of kings and popes, missing the quieter players who moved the pieces. But the parchment isn't blank, it's layered. Scratch the surface of any medieval treaty, and you might find the fingerprints of a woman who ensured its terms. Study the margins of an illuminated manuscript, and hidden notes flutter like trapped moths. Even the architecture whispers secrets: bridges funded by widows, chapels designed by mystics, cloisters that doubled as sanctuaries for the dispossessed. So the next time you study history, don't just ask who held the crown. Ask who held the keys to the scriptorium, the still room, the birthing chamber. Listen for the rustle of parchment under nuns' habits, the clink of coins in alewives' pouches, the hum of ballads carrying coded messages, because behind every throne there were women weaving threads into lifelines, their voices echoing where the chronicles fell silent. The past isn't a monologue, it's a chorus, and if you lean in close, you'll hear the verses they never wanted